Good morning, everyone. This is Sara. This is the course Mathematical Economics 2. Remember that this course is both for English section students, the credit hour system students, and the Arabic section, the old system students. As you know that this course is taught in English. Today is March 24 and this is our lecture number 14. Before we start, the first lecture that I gave, which was audio recorded, was on March 17. This was lecture number 12. I think I have corrected it, but if you find that the lecture number is not 12, so the correct number for lecture of March 17 is lecture number 12. And then on March 22, Nurhan solved with you some exercises on the derivative rules, and it showed to you how to solve and calculate the derivatives, which was very important for the second part of our course. Today we will study another economic application, which is the Keynesian national income analysis in details. We studied the Keynesian national income model before, but it was the simple model. Starting from this lecture, we will explain the national income model, the Keynesian national income model in details. This is our second main economic application. Before going into the model itself, I'd like to give you an introduction about the economic thoughts or the schools of economics. As you know, there are two main schools, the classicals and the Keynesians schools of economics. These two schools are the first two schools and they are the most common. I'm sure you heard about these two schools before, but for sure you know also that there are other schools of economics like the growth theories, the neoclassical, the new classical, and the new Keynesian schools. Instead of going through all the schools of economics, it's necessary to mention the main difference between the classicals and the Keynesians to give you an idea about the start of the Keynesian national income model. The classical school believes that the market is working. It believes in the invisible hand. So if we leave everything to the markets will work and reach their equilibrium levels. The classical school is a liberal school. In addition to this, the equilibrium level is characterized by full employment according to the classicals. The classical school focuses on the supply side only because they believe in Say's law, which says that the supply creates its own demand. It was working like this until the Great Depression, which happened in the 1930s, or more precisely on 1929. The Great Depression affected negatively the American economy as well as the European economies. There was depression everywhere almost. They couldn't understand what's going on because they believed in the market and that the market can reach its equilibrium level. At that time, Keynes began to think about the market and if it is really working. So instead of focusing on the supply side like the classicals, Keynes focused on the demand side, which was totally ignored by the classicals. So he emphasized that the equilibrium does not necessarily imply full employment. It can occur at national income levels where there is unemployment. So the economy can operate at levels of unemployment. After having a brief introduction to the Keynesian national income model, we will start by the model assumptions. So before going through the model, I wanted to clarify its assumptions. The first assumption is that the economy consists of only two sectors, the household sector and the business sector. There are two sectors in the economy. Households, this is the sector which consumes, while the business is the sector that invests. So we have only two sectors. One sector consumes, which is the household sector, and the other sector is the sector that invests, which we call the business sector. For the time being, we will keep this assumption of having only two sectors in the economy. Later on, we can add the government sector or the foreign sector. The second assumption that we have in our model is about the commodities produced in the economy. So the model assumes that there is only one commodity in the economy. The economy produces only one commodity that can be either consumed or invested. Continuing with the model's assumptions, the third assumption is that there is a possibility that the economy is not operating at full employment level. Remember when we were stating the differences, the main differences between the Keynesians and the classicals? The Keynesian school of economics stated that the economy can be operating at levels of unemployment. So this is one of the assumptions of the model. There is a possibility that the economy is not operating at full employment levels. There can be some factors of production that are unemployed. And our last assumption is that the investment is exogenous. It is an exogenous variable. Remember the difference between the exogenous and the endogenous variables. This means that the level of investment will be constant or given. It is determined outside the model. These are the four assumptions of the Keynesian national income model. Now let's move to the model itself. Okay. The model, first we need to define our variables. So the first variable that we have is the Y, the capital Y, which refers to the national income or output. Then we have the capital C is the consumption expenditure, and the I is the investment expenditure. Our equilibrium condition of the model is what you can see in front of you, that the Y equals to C plus I, or the national income equals to the consumption plus the investment. So we can write it here in order to clarify something. So we have the Y equals to the C plus the I. This is our equilibrium condition. So as you can notice, Y is the national income or the output, so we can say that this Y represents the supply, okay? While the other part, the C plus I, represents what? They represent the demand expenditures, okay? So the consumption expenditures plus the investment expenditures, they are representing the demand expenditures, which for sure determines the value of the output from the equation that we have. So again, the Y is the supply, while the C plus I is the demand expenditures. Remember that we have the consumption function, which is C equals to A plus BY, where, as we know, we are going to take this in the next slide. So let's move to the next slide. So here, the consumption function, as we mentioned, it is equal to A plus BY. What are these? We know that C is the consumption expenditures, and we know the Y is the national income or output. What about the A and B? We have A is the autonomous consumption. Okay, so we have A is the autonomous consumption, which should be the vertical intercept of the consumption function. It will be clear when we draw the graph for the consumption function. And then the B is the marginal propensity to consume. So if we want to represent the consumption function graphically, let's do this. We need to draw the x-axis and the y-axis. This is the y-axis and this is the x-axis. We have on the x-axis the y, the national output, and we have on the y-axis the C, the consumption. In order to draw the consumption function, first of all, we have the marginal propensity to consume, which is this part here, the B. This is the slope of the consumption function as we studied before. You can notice that the slope is positive. Then we have the autonomous consumption. And this means that if we want to draw the consumption function, we will not start from the origin, but we will start from a positive quantity that has the value A. So all this part is the value A. Then we can draw the consumption function, an upward sloping straight line, because this is what the equation in front of us is stating. So this green straight line is representing the consumption function C, which is equal to A plus BY. Now let's move to study the marginal propensity to consume and the average consumption. The marginal propensity to consume means the change in consumption when income changes by 1 unit. So it is the slope of the consumption function, as I stated in the previous slide. Again, the marginal propensity to consume, it measures the change in consumption when income changes by 1 unit, which is the slope of the consumption function. It is dC by dy. What will happen to the consumption when the income changes by 1 unit? And if you go back to the equation, the consumption function equation, you know that C equals to A plus BY, so you can easily calculate the derivative of this function and you will find that this derivative or the slope equals to B. That's why we define this B as being the marginal propensity to consume. Now let's move to defining what is the average consumption. The average consumption measures the ratio between the consumption and income. So average consumption is the level of consumption divided by the level of income or the level of output. This means that the C over Y, the level of consumption divided by the level of output, this fraction here, is just the average consumption. How can we calculate this ratio? We have the consumption function A plus BY. We will divide this function by Y. And doing this, you will get that the average consumption equals to A divided by Y plus B. What if A equals to 0? A is the value of the autonomous consumption. If there is no autonomous consumption, or if A equals to 0, then our consumption function will be simply equals to BY, because the A is 0. So this will be our consumption function. If we want to calculate the marginal propensity to consume for this case, you can easily calculate it. What is dC by dy? Yeah, it is B. What about the average consumption? Remember how we calculated the average consumption? We did that by dividing the consumption function by y. Under this case, we have the consumption function equals to by. If we are going to divide c by y, what we will get? We will get also b. So if we have the autonomous consumption equals to 0, we will get that the marginal propensity to consume equals to b and the average consumption equals to b also. How can we show this graphically? We need to draw the graphs. So let's do this. We will draw the x-axis and the y-axis. The horizontal line is the x-axis, so we have we put on the x-axis the y, the national output or income, and the vertical line is our y-axis, and we put on the vertical line the consumption function. We want to draw the consumption function under this case, which is having a equal to 0. If we have a equals to 0, this means that there is no vertical intercept because we will start from the 0, right? If we want to draw the consumption function here, what is a? A is 0, so we will start from this point here. And then we will go up drawing the consumption function. So this is the consumption function, c equal to by, because we are studying the case when the autonomous consumption equal to 0. If we want to show the slope of this function, let's use a different color. So showing the slope of this function, for example, at this point, what is the slope? We know that this, okay, the line is not correct. Okay, so the slope is just this triangle here, the O. Let's write this O, Y, C. So this is the slope. This triangle is representing the slope of the consumption function C equals to by. Okay? You will notice that this slope is equal to C because all this vertical line has the value C, while this horizontal line has the value y. So we can say that the slope is equal to C over y. Okay, but C over y is just the average consumption. So it is clear that if we have autonomous consumption equals to 0, we will have the marginal propensity to consume equals to the average consumption, which is the slope of which is equal to b, the slope of the consumption function. So again, if we have the autonomous consumption equals to 0, we will have the marginal propensity to consume, the slope of the consumption function will be equal to C over Y, which is the average consumption. So C over Y will be equal to B. Okay? Now let's move to the general case, which is the case that we stated at the beginning when we were introducing the concept of the marginal propensity to consume and average consumption. What if A does not equal to 0? If it is any positive value, then we will have the consumption equals to A plus BY, which is the general equation of the consumption function that we stated at the beginning. We know that the marginal propensity to consume for this function is B. And if we wanted to calculate the average consumption this time, we have to divide the C by Y. So we will get the average consumption equals to A over Y plus B. Okay? Graphically, what does this mean? Let's draw the graph and see if it is the same as the previous graph that we drew. Again, we draw the x-axis and the y-axis. We have national output or national income on the x-axis, and we have the consumption on the y-axis. This time we will not draw the consumption function starting from 0. Why? Because we have a positive intercept. So as we draw the consumption function before, it will be starting from a positive value, and we will have this consumption function is upward sloping. If we wanted to get the slope of the consumption function, then we can easily get it by this triangle. So at this point, this red and green triangle, so we have here A, let's call this Q, and let's call this point V. Okay, so that triangle AQV is just representing the slope of the consumption function, which is the B. What about the average consumption? Average consumption, remember that it is equal to the consumption divided by the level of output. At this point Q, what is the level of consumption? So at this point, the level of consumption is just all this line. So all this is the C. And what is the Y? The Y is this value here. So this is representing the Y. Okay. So where is the average consumption? The average consumption will be this triangle Q, Y, and 0. Okay. As you can see, there is a difference this time because we have autonomous consumption. There is a difference between the average consumption and the marginal propensity to consume. Because it is clear also that this angle here, which is representing the tan of this angle, the A, is different from, which is representing the average consumption, is different from the angle of this line here. If we want to get this angle, so the angle here, this is different from the angle A. This will be the angle B. So tan B will give the slope of the consumption function, while tan A will give us the average consumption. Now it's clear that when we have autonomous consumption that is not equal to 0, there will be a difference between the marginal propensity to consume and the average consumption. And you can show this graphically as the graph that is drawn in front of you. It's enough for today's lecture. If you have any questions, you can send me by email, and I will get back to you as soon as I read your email. Thank you for today, and see you next lecture.